Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a question we've been getting a lot. Is Flutter still worth learning in 2024? Especially with all the cool stuff happening over in the JavaScript world, like Bun and Svelte 5.
Hmm.
We've got your articles and forum discussions right here, so let's dive in.
It's a question on a lot of developers' minds these days, especially those just starting out, there's just so much excitement about all these different technologies. It can be, well, kind of overwhelming to know where to even start, where to focus your learning.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, we've got this forum discussion right here. Someone who's totally new to programming, they're interested in Flutter, but they're also seeing all this buzz about JavaScript and wondering if that's where they should be focusing their energy. Instead, it's that classic, ooh, shiny object syndrome.
It really is. And one thing that really resonated with me from that discussion was a comment from a more experienced developer who pointed out, the danger of getting too fixated on just one language or one framework. Like they really emphasized the importance of seeing yourself as a software engineer first, someone who can, assess a problem and then choose the best tool for that job.
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
It's about having that broader perspective and not like getting stuck in one little corner too early on.
Yeah.
So with that software engineer mindset, right? Let's keep that in mind as we look at why Flutter is still super relevant in 2024. We've got this really in-depth article here from a Flutter expert who makes a pretty compelling case for why it's worth looking into. One of the big ones they highlight is the ability to develop for multiple platforms, right? So that's mobile, web, even desktop, all from a single code base.
Yeah, this cross-platform capability is a huge draw for a lot of developers. I mean, think about it. Write your code once and then boom, deploy it across multiple platforms. Saves you time, effort, resources. It's a game changer, especially if you're an independent developer or part of a startup with limited resources.
For sure. And the article also dives into some of Flutter's other advantages, like its hot reload feature.
Oh, yeah. Hot reload is fantastic.
So imagine being able to make a change to your code and see it reflected in real time on your device or emulator. No more waiting for those builds to finish.
Huge productivity booster. That instant feedback loop can really speed up development, and it makes the whole process a lot more engaging. You're not sitting around waiting.
Definitely. Now let's talk aesthetics. The author of this article, they seem really impressed with Flutter's visual capabilities.
Yeah.
Apparently, it's got some really great libraries that can help you create some polished-looking apps.
It does. And those libraries, they often draw inspiration from popular design languages. Things like Google's Material Design and Apple's Cupertino style. Oh, okay.
Yeah, and that means you can create apps that really feel native to whatever platform you're targeting, whether it's Android or iOS. It provides a much more seamless user experience.
That's so important, especially as users are getting more and more design savvy. They can tell when something feels off. Now, what about the more technical underpinnings of Flutter? The article mentions something about Dart. Is that right?
Yes, Flutter uses the Dart programming language.
Whoa.
And one of the interesting things about Dart is it's designed to be both easy to learn, but also powerful enough
Oh.
to handle complex applications.
Okay.
So it's a really good choice for beginners and experienced developers alike.
I like that. It's accessible, but then there's also room to grow with it. Now, how does Flutter stack up in terms of performance? I always hear that cross-platform development, it always comes with a performance hit.
That's a common concern.
Yeah.
But one of Flutter's strengths is actually its performance. Unlike some other cross-platform frameworks that rely on web views, Flutter actually compiles to native code.
Oh. Yeah. So this means that your apps are generally going to run faster, smoother. They'll provide a more native-like experience overall.
So it sounds like Flutter has a lot going for it in 2024. But I'm curious about the more practical side of things. Let's say someone is convinced, right, about Flutter and its potential. When does it actually make sense for them to sit down and really invest the time to learn it?
That's a great question. And the article actually does a really good job of outlining some, well, specific scenarios where learning Flutter in 2024 could be a really smart move. For example, even if you're not sure if Flutter will end up being your main development tool, the author argues that just learning it can make you a more well-rounded developer in general.
Yeah, I see that. It's like adding another tool to your tool belt, right? Like you're exposed to a different way of thinking about UI design and code structure, even just how programming languages themselves can be structured.
Exactly. It broadens your horizons, gives you more options down the line. And another interesting point the article makes is that Flutter can be a fantastic tool for prototyping. Like if you want to test out an app idea, you can quickly build a working version of your app that runs on, both iOS and Android. Get feedback from users, refine your concept, all without the expense of building separate native apps.
That's huge for anyone who wants to test the waters with an app idea or even just get that minimum viable product out there quickly. Like imagine, let's say you've got this idea for a fitness tracker app. With Flutter, you could have a working prototype and it's running on both major mobile platforms way faster than if you were building natively for each one. You could get that in front of users, get their feedback, and then make changes early on.
It's a much more agile approach to development, and that speed, that can be a real advantage these days. And speaking of agility, the article also highlights just how cost-effective Flutter can be for cross-platform development. So instead of having to hire like separate iOS and Android teams, which can be really expensive, especially for startups, you can have one team develop for both platforms using Flutter.
Right. It's like the whole lean startup approach, but applied to app development. You're being smart about how you use your resources, and that can free up your budget to focus on other things like marketing or user acquisition. The author also touched upon Flutter's value for education and learning, which is something I know you're passionate about.
Absolutely. Flutter has so much to offer in educational settings. Like we talked about before, the Dart language, it's designed to be beginner-friendly, so it's a great way for people to get started with programming. But it's also robust enough that you can build some pretty complex applications with it. So it's a really valuable tool for teaching core programming concepts and then building up to those more sophisticated projects.
It's finding that sweet spot of being approachable, but also having a lot of depth. Now, we've covered a lot of ground on the benefits, but I want to make sure we're looking at this from all sides, right? No technology is perfect. So there have to be situations where maybe Flutter isn't the best choice.
That's true. And to its credit, the article does talk about some potential drawbacks. One of the things it brings up is the job market. Like you really have to look at your specific area.
Right. Even if Flutter is becoming more popular overall, it's still important to do your research, see if there's actually demand for Flutter developers where you are.
Exactly. Are companies hiring for Flutter specifically? Or are they sticking with native? Or maybe they're using another cross-platform framework like, React Native. Those are important things to consider before you go too deep into learning any new technology. You want to make sure your skills are actually going to be valuable, right?
It's about being strategic. Now, even if Flutter is a good fit for the job market, are there any technical limitations that we should be aware of?
There are a few. Flutter is great in a lot of ways, but there are times when native development might still be the better way to go. One example the article mentioned was applications that need the absolute best performance possible. Things like video editing or 3D games.
So even though Flutter apps, they're generally very performant, they compile to native code, there are still some edge cases where native development is what you need to squeeze out that last bit of performance.
Exactly. It's all about understanding the trade-offs. Another thing to think about is how much your app needs to work with really specific device features or hardware.
Right. Flutter can bridge to native code, but if your app really depends on those native features, it could get kind of messy.
Yeah, it could. And in those cases, it's about weighing the benefits of being cross-platform with Flutter against those potential headaches of managing all the native integrations. It might just be that sticking with native development is just simpler, even if it means you're writing more code in the long run.
So it's not always a cut and dry decision. There's a lot of factors at play. What about existing teams? Does the article talk about that at all?
It does. They mention that if you've got a team and they're already really good at native iOS or Android development, it might not make sense to switch things up and introduce Flutter, at least not without thinking it through carefully.
Right. It's about picking the right tool for the job, for the team. And sometimes that means sticking with what you know, especially if things are already working well.
Exactly. I mean, anytime you bring in a new technology, there's going to be a learning curve, some bumps along the way. So you really got to weigh those costs against the benefits.
For sure. So, okay, we've gone really deep on Flutter, talked about the good, the bad, all the things to consider. What's the final word? Someone's listening, trying to decide if Flutter is worth their time in 2024. What do you tell them?
Honestly, it all comes back to what you want to do, your goals as a developer. There's no right or wrong answer here.
It's not about Flutter being good or bad overall, but whether it fits what you specifically want to achieve.
Right. If you're excited by, building these really nice looking apps, performant apps that can run everywhere, and you're cool with learning Dart, then yeah, Flutter's definitely worth a look.
It sounds like it could be a really good fit for like independent developers, startups, or anyone who really wants to reach as many users as possible without the hassle of multiple code bases.
It could. It could. And even if you end up deciding that Flutter isn't your main thing, the stuff you learn along the way, that
Mm.
experience is going to make you a more well-rounded developer.
You'll have a better picture of how cross-platform development works, and you've added to your skill set, which is huge in this field.
Always be learning, always be growing.
Love that.
Yeah.
And you know what? This whole conversation got me thinking. We've been talking about Flutter and JavaScript like it's one or the other. But what if you combine them?
Interesting. Yeah, there's definitely some potential there, some really cool hybrid approaches you could take.
Imagine you use JavaScript, your favorite framework, build the core of your app as a web app first.
You're taking advantage of all those JavaScript libraries and tools, right?
Exactly. And then you use Flutter to make the mobile version, basically moving that core logic from the web app over.
So you're getting the best of both worlds, that maturity and flexibility from JavaScript on the web, but then Flutter gives you that performance, that native-like feel on mobile.
Thinking outside the box. It's a perfect example of how, when you explore new tech, you get new ideas, new possibilities open up.
It's about experimenting, pushing those boundaries, seeing what we can do.
Love it. Well, I think we have thoroughly explored the depths of Flutter today. To the listener who asked this question, hopefully this gives you a much better sense of what Flutter brings to the table, where it excels, where it falls short, and most importantly, where it might fit into your development journey. Remember, stay curious, keep that learning going, and never be afraid to try new things. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time.